These explosions coming just days after Europe's most wanted man, suspected Paris attacker Salih Abdeslam, was arrested.
So, why Brussels? Why is that city suddenly a hotbed for jihadists? Let's bring in Dr. Jasser. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a former U.S. Navy lieutenant and commander, and by the way, a practicing Muslim. Why Brussels?
Well, because it's sort of a clinic in what happens in the West when you leave populations alone. You allow the separatist ideologues of their imams. Groups like, by the way, a group called Sharia for Belgium, which had multiple members arrested and convicted in the past, but yet those organizations continue. You have radical groups, ideologues that are not only terror cells, but around them supporting communities. You're not a terrorist who's on the lam and goes back to his own neighborhood and hides for 4 months like he did without a supporting neighborhood that does that. And Mozambique is a prime example. They had over 130 jihadists go to Syria from Mozambique alone, let alone the 600 from Brussels itself. So they have a deep problem. It's called Jihadi Central, and nobody's treating the ideology of Islamism. So you're going to continue to see problem.
Well, what do you want us to do, Dr. Jasser? I mean, how do we treat it? It's not a matter of economic opportunity. We know some of the richest people, some of those affluent people like Muhammad Atta had money, right? He had options. The guy went to college. A lot of these people have options. They choose this.
Well, we need a strategic approach to the Muslim community that includes engaging reformers, that includes engaging our Muslim reform movement, that ostracizes and marginalizes Islamists, not only groups like CARE, the Islamic Society of North America, groups in Europe like Sharia for Belgium, but identifies them like we did the Communist Party in the Cold War. We never identified nonviolent communists as our allies against the Soviets, but yet today we're engaging so-called moderate Islamists who are basically part of the folks in the stadium cheering on the jihadists. They may not be militant, but they're cheering them on and supporting them and fueling the ideas. And until we recognize that Islam is not a race, it's not a skin color, it is an ideology that supports the destruction of the West, which is Islamism, while Muslim reformers are part of the solution.
Yeah, Dr. Jasser, you know that in this particular neighborhood where they were able to take down this terrorist a couple of days ago, there's very little police presence there. And it's a connection between the police and the community is not accepting, from the reports I have read, of them. And so, you know, they're just a closed, isolated neighborhood where who knows what's going on, right?
Well, exactly. And the only way you're going to get beyond the separatism that continues to widen the chasm is to knock down the political correctness, the multiculturalism, and begin to say that political Islam, this ideology that demonizes the West, demonizes free speech, demonizes Jews, and this ideology of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel policy, all of these things are part of the same cancer. And until we recognize that these communities are incubators for that and begin to look at their media, their social media presence, and connect the dots of their newspapers in the neighborhoods, their Twitter presence and YouTube videos, all these things that are only not about, because right now, by the way, our policy is only about countering violent extremism. What is that? It's just terrorism, which is a symptom.
Right.
Until we counter violent Islamism, which is a theocratic ideology that is incubated in these neighborhoods. And by the way, Muslim reformers can do that. But as long as we don't call it Islamism, you're not going to be able to target them and unravel the onion that is creating these militants.
Dr. Jasser, though, how many times have you heard that Islam is a peaceful nation, a peaceful religion?
Listen, I love my faith. I look at my kids every day, and I fear for the world that they're going to grow up in, because the Islam that we love is going to wither on the vine if we allow this radical political ideology that isn't just a little few militants. It's a political ideology that won elections in Egypt, that has large movements of ISIS, Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, runs governments in Saudi Arabia and Iran. So this huge movement of hundreds of millions is going to destroy our faith. if we don't wake up and begin to connect the dots of Brussels, Paris, of Chattanooga, San Bernardino, these are simply symptoms. And Muslims who love their faith need to get on board of the need to reform and stop the denial, or else it's not just about racism, it's about an ideology and the time in history that Islam is in today.
So you say there is hope to reform radical Islam and these terrorists that are killing so many people around the world?
Absolutely. I mean, every faith has gone through this. I mean, our founding fathers created a wonderful country fighting back against theocracy. The theocrats of Islam are not our allies in Saudi Arabia and Iran. They are breeding these militants. And until Muslims can begin to reform against the theocrats that are allowing these militants to be created and fueled, we are going to continue to see this. It's not just Muslims that grab a suicide belt. It is those who believe that laws should be based in Sharia, right, that hands should be cut for stealing, women don't have rights. That's all the reforms that have to be done in order to finally defeat terrorism. But
instead of going back that far, let's just go back the last 15 years. The thought was, if you give these young Muslims a sense of life and hope and a future, like democracy, a representative government, that they begin to flourish and see the promise and see more than life of just being a suicide vest away from ending. So George Bush did that, giving people an option to vote on their future in Afghanistan and Iraq and some surrounding cities. Next thing you know, without the strong man, the place becomes a terror den in Libya, in Syria, and you look over in Iraq, and even in Afghanistan as the Taliban comes back. In the short term, I see no light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, you know, we've done partial solutions. President Bush, certainly with the Freedom Agenda and others, was headed in the right direction. But as long as we don't identify the nonviolent ideology of Islamism as the problem and as the incubator of militant Islam, we're not going to get to the end zone, which is Muslim reform against theocracy. And that's why we've not had a long-term strategy. You can't have a short-term strategy unless you have a long-term strategy about where you're headed. And we have not been clear that we are headed to defeat the theocrats, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which are all these Muslim-majority countries that are brewing cauldrons of radical Islam, that we say, oh, they're our allies. They're not our allies. They are fueling militancy that calls me an apostate, that tells reformers that we don't have a voice, and they're continuing to be part of the main problem.
So many times, Dr. Jasser, after terror attacks, we try to get your opinion on what is happening behind the scenes. But ultimately, you know, if somebody's in the terror business, what they were able to do today in Brussels, that goes in the win column for them.
It does. They're winning. And this is a war. And we have to understand that there are so many fronts to this battle. It's a front, as you've all been fighting for in the media, about free speech. It's a front about, you know, Muslims who are going to embrace democracy versus those who are going to embrace theocracy. It's a front in homeland security, and that we have to knock off and not be afraid to profile and follow ideas, not just following those who want to grab weapons, in which often it's too late by the time we realize it. It's a front also in universities, where we see the racialization of an idea like Islam and Islamism, rather than actually confronting debates that we need to have in our universities. There's so many fronts to this battle, and as long as political correctness and fear of being called a bigot dominates, we can't have the conversation that you and I have had so many times.
There is a lot of PC, and there is a lot of worry about that. Dr. Jasser, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.